That's the ding. Oh, yep, that shows recording. All right, everybody. So, EVO, Evolved Web Components, without all the boilerplate. This is something that I started back in February. So who am I? I'm Mike Collins, Michael Collins, Mikey Collins. As long as I know you're talking to me, I don't care what you call me. I've been working computers forever. I've worked in just about every language you can imagine. My first HTML I actually wrote with Netscape Navigator and IE3. I've worked for Software Toolworks, Broderbund, Intel, Family Search, and a lot of other companies. I currently work at STG as a developer and a practice manager. And I have used just about every modern framework with the exception of maybe Svelte. But I still prefer writing in vanilla JavaScript. And I believe that as a senior developer, it is my job to make things easier, faster, and smaller for not only other developers, but also for the end user. So web frameworks, right? We all know them. React, Angular, Vue, Svelte, and so on, right? Their job was to try to solve the hard things. They were trying to make things that were normally considered difficult or very boilerplate simple. And so they do that, but there's often a steep cost, right? They have some of them have some very complicated rules, non-standard terminology, non-standard technology, and a lot of times we have to write code for the framework's sake. It's like, it's pointless code, but you have to do it just to make the framework work. And then, of course, the biggest cost is in rewriting everything when the next shiny framework is required by your company. When I was at Family Search, we went through, in the 10 years I was there, 5 different frameworks. And up until the last one, everything was 100% rewrite. And it was just like, this is ridiculous. This is taking way too much of our time. So web components, so much promise and so hard to create. So these guys were created originally, the spec was created back in 2011. There was a V0 spec. Then there was a V1 spec. And then by 2019, all the current browsers supported it. Web components are difficult to write a lot of times because of all the boilerplate. And CSS can be a problem if you create a non-shadow DOM element. And the biggest reason for that is that if your non-shadow DOM element gets stuck into another element that is shadow DOM, you got to make sure that your CSS is in the shadow DOM of that component. And so that bit a lot of people a lot of times. There's no simple binding. There's no simple events. You have to do it all through raw JavaScript. And so the code for native components tends to be very large and very complicated. So this is a minimal web component. All right, the top one there is just a web component without shadow DOM. And in the connected callback function, you can go ahead and set the inner HTML, and then that will show up. The comment or custom element define line just tells what the name is going to be connected to that class. The bottom chunk of code, same thing, but it actually uses shadow DOM, which you actually can do earlier on in the process. You do it in the constructor instead of the connected callback. So web component projects and frameworks, there's a lot of them. There's actually probably close to 30 of them out there that I've seen as I was working on mine. Polymer was the first, and it was designed to bridge the gap between the V0 spec, the V1 spec, and browsers that didn't support it at all. And over time, they were saying, oh, our goal is to eventually fade away. They faded by just dropping it eventually. Some of the other ones that are a little more recent are Lightning Web Components, Slim.js, Stencil, and Lit Element. And Bay.js is the newest one I saw. And I don't remember how I learned about it. Somebody pointed it out to me, and I went and I looked, and I thought, well, this is really cool. But as my last bullet point shows, they perform all of their work at the runtime in the browser. And I thought, that's kind of dumb. Why always have the browser have to process everything? So I came up with EVO. This was back in February, mid-February. I started this project, and it is a transpiler. The idea is that you write something in a template file, and then you compile it, and it becomes raw JavaScript, a component. I've got a lot of different things planned in this series of features. This particular one is EVO WC, or EVO Web Components. And the main objectives are very easy for developers, right? I want to solve problems for developers without creating problems for developers. So my goal on this is that you only write what you need, to be standards-based where possible, to provide built-in data and event binding and conditional directives, so ifs, switches, and fors, a very fast and small runtime, minimal memory, minimal CPU, and thus minimal battery usage. And I want to move as much of the work as possible to the compile time, not the runtime, so that your runtime is very, very light. So a minimal EVO web component is the code chunk down below. Basically, you create a component element, set the tag attribute for your desired element name, and then add a template for the HTML, a style for the CSS, and script for the JavaScript. This particular example doesn't show any JavaScript because it doesn't need it, right? All this is going to do is stick an H1 tag in the component and color it yellow. Down in the bottom right, you'll see how to use it. You just specify the tag, and you're good to go after you import it. So once EVO is going to be made public by mid-August. I am really close to my version 1. There's a couple bugs I ran into over the past couple of weeks that I've got to get resolved. Once those are done, then I'll go ahead and I'll get this released. Once it is, you install EVO by using npm, just like anything else. Copy the base class file, and if you want it, the router file, into your static JavaScript folder, whatever folder you're going to be serving up your JavaScript files from. Create your own folder to put your template files in, and then write your template files. You will add one line, and I just called this one build, into your package.json file, which basically just says, compile all of my files in the components folder and stick them in source.js components. Whatever your directory structure is, you'll use that. And then in your HTML, you import your components, and you start using them. So the component file, the template file that I have, basically, you start off with a component tag, and then inside there are 4 subtags that you can have. There's template again for the HTML, style, script, and then script root. And the biggest difference between script and script root is script is where all of the class methods and properties go. And script root is stuff that's placed at the top of the file. So for example, where's my mouse? There we go. Wow. I don't like that I can't see my mouse. Okay, so here's an example. The component is going to be called if-1, and it's got its template, which has a bunch of stuff in it. It's got the style, the script root, that export is going to be showing at the top. It's going to be inserted into the top of the generated file. And then the toggle state ends up being, and the pound in front of it just means private. That's standard JavaScript, will be a private member function of the generated class. And unfortunately, browser or editors don't understand this. They're like, wait, you can't create a function like that. And it's like, well, that's because it's in a class. So I'm working with some people to actually get a modification for VS Code that will actually properly understand how this works and handle that for you. Let me see. Sorry. Let me just exit this for a second. So so this is a simple component, and when it's compiled, it gets converted into this. There's a few things that get set up. There's some imports. There is a base class that is needed. There's the name and some information that's all exported, so you know what this component is generating. The template HTML is put in there. The style stuff is put in there. And then we create the element deriving from this, and we do it as a function because it allows you to derive from any other object. And then in this particular case, that's it. That's the whole component, because everything else is handled by the base class. All right, CPAs, component property attributes. I've gone through about 20 different names for this thing, and this one came out as probably the most understood by people. And again, I wish I could show my mouse on this screen, but I can't. Down in the example code, you've got component, tag is myl, and then colon message equals stir colon hello evo. The colon message is a component property attribute. It's an attribute of the component tag that defines a property of the component. And then down on the third line in the H1, you'll see the colon text equals message. And what that's saying is put the whatever value for message is as the text content of the H1 tag. And so basically you can add all you want for up in there. And these are, you only need a CPA if you actually want to be able to use it dynamically. If you don't, then I can show you ways how to do it otherwise. Anyway, bottom right corner is an example of using the element by setting the message there. Then instead of it putting hello evo in between the H1 tags, it will actually in that case say hi everyone. And I'll be showing some of these in a bit. So CPAs are defined using snake case. Think of this as like the differences between CSS and in a CSS file and CSS through code, right? In this particular case, CPAs are defined using snake case always, and in lowercase, and I just lowercase everything because HTML is case independent. EVO supports a lot of different data types too. So string or stir, Boolean or bool, number, integer, big int, date, array, and object are all predefined data types that you can give it. Int, big int, and number can have an optional min and max limit applied to them. Arrays and objects can use JS docs at type def that is defined in the script root block, and I'll demo that in a little bit too. You can create public CPAs and you can create private CPAs. The big difference here is that a public CPA is available through public properties of the class, whereas private CPAs are not. They're only usable inside the class. And Jen, if people are asking questions, I can't see on my screen anything, so please let me know.
Okay, Robert Rowe just said steak case, question mark, kebab case. I don't know what that means, but you will.
Oh, yeah, I've heard it called kebab case, snake case. I believe they're synonymous. But it's like the example there where I say snake case, right? It's word dash word dash word. So using CPAs in your templates, one-way data binding is the first thing we do. So CPAs are compiled into property getters and setters in your component. Both the public and the private are. It's just that you can't access the private ones from outside of the class. Setters will convert the data that is passed into it into the proper type if possible. Now there are some conditions where if it's not possible, then it ends up becoming null. And those are just standard rules. I'm trying to emulate what a lot of the default components in HTML do. Public CPAs can also be set through the component's attributes. So if you do a set attribute in this particular case of this component, if you do a set attribute of message and pass that through, then that ends up working its way through into the setter of the property. And so and CPAs can be data bound into your template. So in this example, in the H1 tag, the title property is going to be set to being whatever the title CPA value is. The text content, and that's a special one I'll talk about later. So the colon text represents text content and colon HTML represents inner HTML, is going to be set to whatever the value of the message CPA is every time they change. I purposely made it to where the only thing you can put inside of the data binding is a CPA. I don't want code run in there because that tends to lead to really sloppy code. Now, if people can Give me enough reasons, I may change my mind on that. But right now, I've seen so many problems with code being stuck into binding that it's like, no. I do support pipes similar to angulars. I've got a thing on that. And so in the second example, basically, whatever is in the image CPA will be passed through the add ending pipe, at which point it could do the logic like is shown up above, where it could add the .jpg if you wanted it to. CPAs in the code and in the template, you deal with them through camel case. So again, following the specifications of how CSS works, CSS has the snake case or whatever you want to call that. But in the code, you deal with it in camel case. And so in your code, you always deal with it in the camel case format. You can force setting an attribute as opposed to a property by just prefacing it with add or dot, and then whatever you want for the CPA variable. Text content is done using colon text, and the inner HTML is done that way. There are a couple other things that are done automatically. I'll cover them at the end here, but like class ends up using class name as opposed to class list, although I'm thinking about some possible upgrades to that, maybe version 2.
Mike?
Yeah.
Robert said, I'm sorry, I do not know what CPA is.
So CPA is, again, it's the component property attribute. It's the, in this example here, that in the component tag on the left, you get the colon message. That is a CPA. It's defining the property of the component by using the attribute colon message. And again, if the naming doesn't work, because like I said, I've gone through about a dozen different names. If the naming doesn't work, I'd like to know. But we'll stick with it for now. So this is an example of how the binding works. The code on the right is basically what's happening with the compiled code. And so in the H1 on the left, we're saying, oh, set the inner text, the text content, to whatever the value of message is. In the message setter, we go through and make sure that it's the right type. We compare it to make sure it's changed. If it's changed, that last line there, the this.els.el0.text content, is where we're actually setting this. So unlike a lot of other frameworks where they're doing DOM diffing and all this other stuff at runtime, I know what the DOM looks like at compile time, and I only change what needs to be changed. In this case, I changed the text content. Now, you're looking at going EL0, what the heck is that? As it compiles, every component or every tag that has any kind of binding done to it gets assigned a name. In this case, H1 will be assigned EL0. It'll be different based upon the time, although you can, in the H1, you can say EL equals and give it your own name. And so that's kind of like refs in React. So if you want to get to a specific element, you just give it a name, and then you can actually get to that using the same logic of this.els. Whatever the name was you gave it. Two-way binding. So it's built in, it's auto. If you use the colon value or colon checked properties in your input element or text area or select, then it auto two-way binds. Value is for input elements and text area and so forth. Checked is, of course, for checkboxes. What I do is I automatically insert an event handler to listen for when the data changes. For an input field or a text area, I listen to the input event. For the checkbox, I listen for the change event, which then lets me know that the person has checked on it or whatever. And so then I auto bind it to whatever the variable was or whatever the CPA was that you had specified. And because of this, your components can fully support two-way binding by using the value property and dispatching an input event every time things change. And I'm documenting that. It's not in this demo. Pipes, talked about it before. They're very similar to Angular pipes. The original data is not changed. but I do recommend that you avoid using pipes over and over again. If you've got one page and you're using the same pipe like 5 or 6 times on the same value, then maybe instead it's better to calculate the changed value once and then just have it used everywhere. Pipes can be chained, and they can also be imported from external libraries. So for example, here I'm setting the text content to whatever value message was passed through an externally imported, that's what the arrow means, as it's coming from the outside, function called toUpper. In this example, I'm passing it through a local private function called sanitize. And in this one, I'm passing it through a local public function called sanitize, and then an external function called toUpper. And so you can chain these, you can import them from external so that you can write your pipes once and then use them everywhere. Event binding. So I wanted to make event binding really simple. I kind of somewhat copied the way most of the frameworks do it, but kind of my own little twist on it. In this particular case, we only use DOM events. I'm not doing anything special. Like Angular has its own whole event world. React, some things are events, some things are function calls, and it's like, no, I'm just going to use DOM events, again, standards. And so in your template, you just add a dot click and then the handler name. And so in this example, the button, when you click on the button, it's going to call the private member function on click, which is down below. And all that's going to do is going to increment the count of the variable. And that will automatically, because that's a setter, update the text content of the H1 tag. It's completely automatic. A lot of people are like, well, yeah, but how do you pass data in? Standard base as much as I could, basically use the data set at this point. There's all kinds of different things that you can shove into the data set, including entire objects. And I'll have examples of this in the future here. But EVO will automatically pass the event and the element data set into your event handler code. And so in the on-click function there, event's always first, the data set's always second. And so in this case, I'm just checking to see, is there a dataset.pd? If it's set, then go ahead and call event.prevent default. So in this example here, after the second line there in the button example, I just set data.pd to some CPA value, or I can do regular data-pd without the colon in front of it to some static value. And I'll show that here in just a minute as well. But same example of the code there. Conditionals. EVO can hide and show sections of your code conditionally. I currently support if and switch, but my switch, while it's functional, I'm not happy with how it works, and it's likely to change in the very near future. If works really well, works great, and it's incredibly fast. Basically, the DOM element is either in the DOM or it's held in a variable outside of the DOM. And so as the condition changes, it just reinserts it in the DOM or it pulls it back out of the DOM. And so it's very, very fast. This example right here, if the found variable was true, then the top things is going to show. And if it's false, then the bottom thing will show. Again, I'm not allowing really any conditionals in here or code in here, because again, I want to try and keep all the core logic in your own code, not in the UI. Looping, I support it and it works really well. It works incredibly fast. So in the div inside the template there, you'll see the for. This is one where I'm willing to talk to people about potential changes to it, but I like the way it works right now. Basically, items in this case is an array. You can see up at the top of the component, in the component tag, it says items is an array of type my thing. And then you see down in the script root, this is something I was talking about before, I'm just using JSDocs type def to define what my thing looks like. And I'll talk about TypeScript here in a minute as well. But basically, it's just going to go through and repeat that entire div and everything that's inside of it once per item in the items thing. Now, the items as item.uid. Items is the source array. Item is what you're going to call that element inside of the for loop. And then UID is the key. If you're familiar with React, it would be the key. And so it has to be something unique. You have to always have a key. You're not allowed to do for loops without a key. Similar reasons to why React does. It's to maintain knowledge of what component is what, so that if you're just reversing the loop, then it just reverses the loop. It doesn't have to regenerate everything. And that really matters when you got a lot of content inside of your for item. Okay. So here's another example of data attributes for an event handler. These 3 buttons all have a data-locale thing, and they just specify a different locale. They all call the exact same event handler. And you'll notice that all the event handler is doing is setting the internal locale value to whatever came in off of the data. So it's pulling, if you click on the first button, it'll pull EN, the second button will pull JA, and the third button is RU. And this has worked very, very well. Lifecycle methods, there are some. You have to have lifecycle methods. There's an init function that you can call that happens right after the constructor is finished. There's an update that gets called, and this is also one I'm thinking about potentially improving upon. But anytime any property has been updated, this gets called, where it tells you what member was just updated, what its old value was, and what its new value is, so that you can actually do things if you want to. And I've got lots of examples that I can show over time, not today, on how that works. Connected is basically if you need to do the connected callback or something in a connected callback, you would do connected. Disconnected, same thing for disconnected callback. Adopted for the adopted callback. And add changed is whenever an attribute on the element changes. Same idea, it gives you what attribute changed, what the old value, new value were. These are because the base class handles all of these connected callback, disconnected callback, and so forth. And I didn't want you to overwrite those because I ran into a lot of problems when I tried to overwrite them. So it was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Here's some examples of how to set different, or what setting different bindings does, the left bar or the left panel, compared to what's really happening in the right panel. So if you do :title equals something, then really I'm just doing element.title equals. If you do data.title equals, then I'm just doing element.dataset.title equals. If you do aria dot, then I convert to all the aria tabs or aria things. And the reason I did that is because the next one, right, you can do adder dot something, and that will either do a set attribute or remove attribute, but the aria was important enough to go ahead and say, no, you're your own thing. HTML, of course, becomes inner HTML, text becomes text content, class becomes class name. And there are a series of things that I do where it's like there are no properties, but there are attributes for certain things. And so I will automatically handle those, where if you did like the top one, :title, it's like, well, that doesn't work with the property. It only works with an attribute. I know it, I switch it, and I call the right thing. Questions? And I'm going to do this so I can actually see. No questions. Okay, well, let me show you a couple things that I've got. Let me go this way first. So here's an example component, minimum. All it does is it has some HTML and some that. You saw, I showed you the code, right? It's just that and that. That ends up being this component right here. This particular one here is my if one element. So I come in here with a state. It's Boolean. It defaults to true. And then in here, I'm saying I want the content of this thing to be whatever state is set to. A button that if you click on it, it calls the toggle state function down here. And all it does is it just changes the state. And then I conditionally say if state is set, show this div. If it's not set, show this div. And so in here, you can see it does what it's supposed to. The code on that, a little more complex. As I was mentioning before, I automatically add these ELs so that I know what elements I'm manipulating. And I only need this on the elements that I am manipulating. No, you cannot do that to your CSS. I really don't like the fact that people do dynamic CSS. There are ways you can get around it if you want to, because you can actually embed CSS into the HTML if you really want to do that. But there are really good reasons not to do that. And I'll be talking about those in other presentations. In this particular case then, so I add event listeners, click event listener, this is the button, and it just calls toggle state. This is verifying that we've got an update. If you've got an update function, then it will actually call it. I do always include the build date and the build version that your component was built with. In here, this is the getter and the setter for state that was defined right here. And the getters are very simple, right? They don't do much of anything, but the setters, in this particular case, we know it's going to be a Boolean, so we go ahead and take in whatever the value was, convert it to a Boolean, do our comparisons. If they're different, then we go ahead and save it off for the new value. In this particular case, we set text content. It is complaining about this, saying, oh, no, that's a Boolean, but this is one of my bugs I'm getting fixed. I'll make sure that these always do a toString like they're supposed to do. The conditional code is actually in the base class that I'll show in a second. But basically, I will either hide or show this value or this component based upon this value being this, either true or false. And I do have some things that changes with. And that's it. I just hide and show the different values. Toggle state, this is the code that was in there that we entered here. So that's it. The conditional function, I'll show you that. It makes sure that you've got an element, and we have comment elements, and I can show you that too. But basically, we go through and we make sure, check a bunch of stuff. We figure out, is this particular state valid or not? And if it is valid, then we insert the element after our comment element. If not, we remove it from the DOM. And that's it. That's all that I have to do. The comment elements, on the other hand, if you look in here, so you see this EL3 and EL5 comment, and you'll see that the EL5 element is after that one. If I toggle this and then go back, you'll now see the EL5 element is gone, and the EL3 element is showing up after the EL3 comment. That's how I know where to put them. I automatically insert comments so that I know that, oh, this element belongs right there. And toggling it back, I know that the EL5 element belongs there. So that's how I track all of that. I do have looping, and it's insane how fast this stuff does. I'm doing comparisons to Angular and React, and so far I'm an average of 20 to 100 times faster than they are with both small and large loops. But one of the other things I've got that I haven't really talked about is routing. I actually support routing. I'm not trying to replace Angular or React or Vue. I'm trying to make it to where you can write this code once and use it in whatever your current framework is, and it will work just fine, just like all native elements do. And then when your company wants to switch you over to the next framework, great, these still work. These don't change. Maybe some UI alterations to them, but they won't change. The other thing is with this is I'm going to be supplying a whole slew of built-in elements. What I'm doing is I'm going through the several different component providers, and I'm trying to get their list of standard components that they supply. All of those will be provided with this, all of them. Any other questions? Either I did a really good job or a really bad job, and I'm not sure which. One thing I am asking for people is, if you have questions that you don't necessarily want to ask here, if you have concerns, if you have, if you want to be made aware of when this becomes available, first off, go to the EVO WC website. It should be up within a couple days. And currently the Git repo is private. I will make it public soon. But I want feedback from people. I want to make sure this is actually fitting the bill that I think it's going to be fitting. I love these. These are insanely easy to write. I was shocked with how, I've got my dialogue element. It has a lot of properties, but that's it for the template. There wasn't a whole lot to it. The CSS is probably my biggest part. And then you get down into the code. I've got a little bit of code up at the top because I'm using the button element. And then I wanted some stuff to represent my buttons. And then I've got a couple things here, and that's it. I did not have to write a ton of code because of how this thing gets auto-generated. And that's my goal with all these things, is to make them very simple. Yes, Jared.
So the CSS is built right into the file. It's all in one file. Is that correct?
Currently, I do have plans to where you'll be able to do source equals for this and for the CSS. And I know CSS normally uses a link tag, but you'll do style source equals or you'll do script source equals. And so you'll be able to make them separate files if you want to. That won't be in version 1.0 though. That'll probably be in like 1.2 or 3.
Does the CSS for these elements, do they impact the CSS for the rest of your application?
If you use Shadow DOM, no. And that's because it's following the standards of Shadow DOM and what Shadow DOM does. Now, I will tell you, you can, up here in the component, you can add shadow equals none. Oops. And that will tell this, do not use Shadow DOM. And at that point, yes, your CSS will affect the outside world. So you have to be smart. You can also, the default for Shadow DOM, and those who know Shadow DOM, is open. But you can also use, there is a closed version of Shadow DOM. And so those are the 3 options up there. There's open, closed, and none.
Well, this is very cool.
Thank you. Okay, well, if you guys want more info, I will announce it on the STG Slack channel. I will also announce it on the Utah.js Slack channel when it's finally available. For those who are interested, I'll be giving a very similar presentation at the Salt Lake City Utah.js conference on August, I believe it's 10th, and then at the Lehigh Utah.js conference, or meetup, sorry, the meetups on August 15th. So it'll be very similar to this. So if there are things that didn't make sense, please let me know so that I can fix my presentation before then.
Mike, you've got a question in the chat.
Oh, I'm not watching the chat.
Alpheus said, well, are you able to read it or do you want me to read it to you?
Yeah, so I don't have much experience with the major frameworks, but one reason I've been interested in React is because of React Native. Would this be able to be integrated with something with React Native? So I've never used React Native, but, and I don't know, somebody will have to tell me, does React Native produce HTML, or does React Native produce something totally different? If it produces HTML, these are usable. If you're doing an Electron app, these are usable. If you're doing any kind of website, these are usable, right? This is all stuff that you can use anywhere that you can use HTML. I'm hoping that answers your question. Okay, well, if we don't have any other questions, then I guess we can say we're done.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thanks everybody for coming today.
Yeah,
Thanks, Mike.
thank you. This is great.